Welcome to another deep dive. We've got some really potent material to unpack this time.
Absolutely.
Excerpts from Robert Greene's The 48 Laws of Power. And I know it's a book that's been talked about, quite a bit.
Right.
But we're not doing the usual, quick summary here. We're going in deep.
Yeah.
Extracting those key insights so you can walk away with, real understanding.
Yeah.
Without feeling completely overwhelmed.
Yeah.
By the sheer scope of this work.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, Greene looks at figures from ancient Chinese strategists, Renaissance Italian courtiers, seducers, con men. Like, he's pulling from all these different corners of history and culture
Right.
to distill these principles of power.
It's a really fascinating approach.
It is. It is. And so our goal here is to really explore some of these core ideas that he presents.
Right.
And see how they might actually play out in situations that, you, the listener, could encounter.
Yeah. And how to apply this to our everyday lives, to our work, to our relationship. All of these different scenarios where power dynamics come into play.
Absolutely. And one of the things that really struck me early on in reading these excerpts is this dual perspective.
Yes.
Of looking to the future, but also drawing lessons from the past.
Yeah. And this constant vigilance.
Yes.
That Greene really emphasizes.
Yeah, no days on alert.
Yeah. Yeah. Like always having that strategic foresight.
Yeah. Like it's like a mental exercise that you have to constantly engage in to try to anticipate potential problems.
And not just like passive worrying.
Yeah.
But actually actively trying to envision different scenarios.
Yeah.
And what those implications might be.
Right. And it's not just about being reactive, right? It's about being proactive.
Exactly.
And so that forward-thinking element is coupled with this really deep respect for history that Greene talks about.
Yeah.
And, he uses that symbol of the two faces of Janus, right? One looking ahead, but the other one firmly rooted in what has come before.
And that's not about getting bogged down in the past.
Right.
But it's about extracting the education from it.
Yes.
Learning from, the successes and failures of those who've navigated power before us.
Yeah.
And crucially, learning from our own experiences.
Yeah.
And from the actions of those around us.
Absolutely. And I think that leads to this, really thought-provoking quote from Balzac that he includes, which is, there are no principles, there are only events. There is no good and bad. There are only circumstances.
Yeah, that really throws a curveball.
It does.
At the idea of fixed rules, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I think what Balzac is suggesting here, through Greene's lens, is that the most effective people are those who can adapt and even shape those ever-changing circumstances.
Right. Because if rigid rules governed everything, then, societies wouldn't be constantly evolving.
Right.
And the way that power dynamics shift over time.
Exactly. It points to a need for flexibility in our approach, I think. This continuous process of learning and adjusting based on, the reality of events, not just our preconceived notions.
Yeah. And so let's dig into some of these, laws that Greene outlines.
Yeah.
And I think the first one that really jumped out at me is never outshine the master.
Yeah.
Almost feels wrong, right?
Yeah, it does.
Like the natural inclination is to show your strengths.
Yeah, to want to impress.
Yeah.
To display your abilities.
Yeah.
But Law 1 directly challenges that assumption, I think.
Yeah.
And Greene's argument rests on this idea that everyone, regardless of their position, has insecurities, has vulnerabilities.
Right.
And when you display your abilities too prominently, particularly around those who are in positions of authority, it can breed resentment and insecurity in them.
Yeah.
They might feel implicitly criticized or threatened, even if that's not your intention.
Right. And I think he uses this really compelling historical example to illustrate this point with Louis XIV and his finance minister, Nicolas Fouquet. Can you walk us through that a bit?
Yeah. So Fouquet was a man of immense talent and wealth.
Right.
And he hosted this unbelievably lavish party.
Yeah.
And the sheer opulence of this event, it seemed to overshadow the king himself.
Right.
And shortly thereafter, Fouquet was arrested on charges of embezzling treasury funds. Although much of that spending, was recordedly on Louis's behalf. Yeah. But he then spent decades in solitary confinement.
Wow. Yeah. And it's hard not to see the connection there.
Yeah.
Louis XIV, the Sun King, right? Yeah. Like he was all about being the ultimate symbol of power and grandeur.
All right.
So to be outdone in terms of lavishness, especially by someone who's, serving him, probably didn't sit well. And Greene even notes that, after that happened, Louis appointed Jean-Baptiste Colbert to be Fouquet's replacement.
Yeah.
And Colbert was known for being much more, let's say, conservative.
Yeah. Fiscally responsible.
Yeah.
Colbert made sure that, state finances flowed directly to Louis, who then used those resources to build Versailles.
Right, which was even more magnificent than Fouquet's estate.
Exactly. And he hosted even more extravagant events.
Right.
Often employing, the same architects and artists that Fouquet had patronized.
Right. So the focus was really on who was perceived to be
in control,
and who is allowed to shine the brightest.
Yes.
Right. And so I think this is, something that probably plays out in various ways, like even in the workplace. Have you ever noticed how someone who's, maybe too competent or too eager to kind of like suggest improvements to, the boss's ideas might find themselves kind of subtly sidelined?
It's a brutal but insightful lesson. And Greene extends this beyond royalty too. To look at the relationship between scientists and their patrons. Using Galileo and the Medicis as an example.
And how did Galileo navigate those dynamics?
Well, Galileo's clever strategy was to align his discoveries directly with the prestige of the Medicis.
Right.
So instead of, presenting his findings as potentially challenging, the established views, which, the Medicis represented, he essentially made them appear enlightened and forward-thinking through their association with his work. So he allowed the master to bask in the reflected glory rather than trying to claim the sole spotlight for himself. It's a subtle but significant distinction.
So it seems like the key takeaway from Law 1 is really about being sensitive to those who are above you and their potential insecurities. It's not about hiding your abilities, but it's about directing them in a way that benefits them, or at least doesn't threaten their sense of status. Because the alternative, like the story of Louis XIV, shows can have pretty serious consequences.
And Greene specifically warns against this common mistake of believing that sheer talent will automatically earn you favor with those in power. They might offer superficial praise, but when it comes down to it, they're likely to favor someone who poses less of a perceived threat.
Right. Someone who's not going to potentially outshine them or make them feel insecure.
Right. And this brings up a crucial point. For you to consider, can you recall a time when someone's competence perhaps unintentionally, created friction with someone in a higher position? It's a dynamic that plays out in subtle ways.
It does. So let's move on to Law 2.
Okay.
Never put too much trust in friends. Learn how to use enemies. Now, this also feels a bit counterintuitive.
It does.
We're generally taught to value loyalty and friendship.
That's the conventional wisdom. But Greene offers a more pragmatic, some might say cynical perspective drawn from, historical observation. He argues that friends can be susceptible to envy and might even become demanding or tyrannical in their expectations of you. Conversely, a former enemy often has a greater incentive to prove their loyalty.
Because they have more to prove.
Exactly. Hence the core judgment. Be wary of friends. Hire a former enemy and he will be more loyal than a friend.
And there's almost like a psychological element to that. Where, a friend might take your support for granted. Whereas a former adversary really understands the value of the opportunity you've given them.
And they're less likely to betray that trust because they understand the consequences could be far greater.
The transgression example he uses, I think, is quite telling with Michael III in the Byzantine Empire. And he placed his trust in his close friend Basilius. But Basilius had absolutely no experience. In, matters of governance.
A classic case of promoting someone based on friendship rather than competence.
Yeah. And that didn't end well for Michael III.
No, it did not.
Yeah.
And I think it really highlights, the quote from Diane de Poitiers that Greene includes, which is, to have a good enemy, choose a friend. He knows where to strike. Yeah. That really underscores, the intimate knowledge that a friend possesses of your vulnerabilities, making their betrayal potentially far more damaging.
Yes.
Basilius, despite his initial closeness to Michael, ultimately played a role in his downfall.
Right. Yeah. And so it makes you think about, those potential blind spots.
Yeah.
In our judgment, right?
Yeah.
When we're dealing with those who are
emotionally
close to us.
Exactly. We tend to, let our guard down.
Yeah.
Trust a bit too easily.
Right. But Greene also provides some examples of successful strategic uses of enemies. Right?
He does.
Like Emperor Sun of China.
Yeah.
Using former rivals to strengthen his reign.
Right. Sung recognized that those who had previously opposed him actually had a vested interest in the stability of his rule.
Yeah. Once they were integrated into it.
Exactly. They needed to demonstrate their commitment.
Yeah. It's almost like they have to overcompensate.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
They got something to prove. Yeah. And then there's, of course, the powerful sentiment from Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, which is, do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends?
Yeah, such a powerful quote.
Yeah. It's a really interesting way of looking at it, right? Like this transformative power of turning adversaries into allies.
Right, because then their interests are aligned with yours.
Yeah, and they're no longer a threat.
Exactly. Yeah. And it speaks to, the idea that there's always potential for reconciliation, and that sometimes those who were once opposed to you can become your strongest supporters.
Yeah, absolutely. So the keys to power in law, too, seem to really hinge on understanding this complexity of human motivation.
Yeah, the fact that gratitude can be a fragile foundation for loyalty. And that desire to prove oneself can actually be a really potent motivator.
Right. And then he even quotes Tacitus, who has this rather bleak observation, which is, men are more ready to repay an injury than a benefit because gratitude is a burden and revenge a pleasure.
Ooh.
Yeah. It's a rather unsettling thought.
It is, but it rings true in so many cases throughout history and even in our own lives, I think.
Yeah. And then he also points out this, less obvious benefit of having enemies, which is they can keep you sharp.
Yeah.
Right. They keep you focused.
Keep you on your toes.
They keep you on your toes. He even includes Mao Zedong's argument against the communists who wanted to avoid fighting the nationalists for the Japanese invasion.
Right.
He was saying, no, like, we have to.
Yeah.
We have to fight.
Right.
Because if we just stay idle, we're gonna become weak.
We'll become rusty.
We'll become rusty.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it suggests that, opposition, even in its negative form, can have this kind of galvanizing effect. I mean, it's a really nuanced perspective on relationships.
It is.
And, it's not suggesting that all friendships are inherently dangerous.
Right.
And all enemies are secretly beneficial.
Right.
But it's advocating for this kind of strategic awareness.
Yeah.
Of the potential dynamics at play.
Exactly.
Right.
You have to be discerning. You have to understand the motivations of the people you're dealing with.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And so with that in mind, are there individuals you currently view as obstacles who might, under different circumstances, offer a unique form of insight?
Right.
Or even unexpected loyalty?
Exactly. Sometimes your enemies can see things that your friends can't.
Right. Okay. Let's move on to Law 3. Conceal your intentions.
Yeah.
This feels like it's straight out of, a playbook for espionage.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So the idea here is that, if you seek power, you have to learn to set aside complete honesty.
Yeah.
And really cultivate this skill of disguising your true aims.
Yeah. The core principle is stated pretty directly. If you yearn for power, quickly lay honesty aside and train yourself in the art of concealing your intentions.
Right. And why is this so important? Why is it so important to be able to conceal your intentions?
Because predictability makes you vulnerable.
Right. Yeah. If people know what you're going to do, then they can counter it.
Exactly. They can plan ahead.
Yeah.
They can, set traps for you.
Right.
So you want to keep them guessing.
Yeah.
You want to keep them off balance.
Yeah. And he starts by pointing out that, this is often easier than we imagine.
Because of our natural human tendency to kind of take things at face value.
Yeah.
We're not constantly operating under a cloud of suspicion.
We can't be, right?
Yeah.
We have to trust to a certain degree to function in society.
Yeah, yeah. But that inherent trust in appearances creates an opportunity for those who are skilled in deception.
Exactly.
Right. And so he suggests this key tactic, which is presenting a false objective or desire as a way to distract people from your real goal.
All right, to divert their attention.
Yeah.
To throw them off the scent.
Yeah.
He even mentions its application in seduction.
Yeah.
Sending mixed signals to confuse and intrigue someone.
Right.
Ultimately increasing their interest.
Yeah. And then he provides this, fascinating and very detailed example of this with Yellow Kid Weil and his elaborate con involving Giesel and the staged boxing match.
Right. Yeah.
And this is like a master class in misdirection. It really is. What's so effective about this con is the multi-layered deception involved.
Right.
Well, and his associate didn't initially try to sell Giesel, a fraudulent boxing match. Yeah. Instead, they created this diversion with the supposed sale of a property, this lodge.
Yeah.
And Giesel's focus was entirely on, acquiring this real estate.
Right.
While in the background, they were meticulously constructing this illusion of a legitimate boxing opportunity.
That's right.
Complete with convincing financiers.
Right.
And a boxer, Gross, who gave a brief but believable demonstration of his, limited skills.
Right. So it was all about creating this appearance of legitimacy.
Yeah.
Right. And so the $35,000 for the lodge was simply a means to get Giesel to transfer funds.
Right.
Which they then redirected.
Exactly. The lodge sale was the believable facade. Yeah.
That mask the true swindle.
Right. So the lodge was the bait.
Yes.
The thing Giesel believed was genuine, while the boxing match was the actual mechanism they used to take his money.
To take his money.
Right. And so this is, what Greene calls this broad smoke screen, right? Creating this overall atmosphere of normalcy to operate undetected.
Exactly. And he also discusses the noble gesture as another powerful form of smokescreen.
Right.
People are inclined to believe in apparent acts of generosity and often overlook the self-serving motives that might lie beneath.
Right.
And the example of art dealer Joseph Duvine's role in establishing the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. is a perfect illustration of this.
Right.
So it appeared to be this purely philanthropic endeavor, but it also conveniently
provided, significant tax benefits for his wealthy clients.
Right.
It freed up wall space in their homes for further acquisitions, and it helped to maintain high prices for their existing art collections.
Right.
So the public saw this generous donation. Duvine's client saw, very tangible financial advantages.
Right. So the seemingly selfless act concealed very practical benefits for Duvine and his clientele. It makes you kind of reconsider some of those acts of apparent altruism.
It does. It makes you wonder what the underlying motives are.
Yeah. Greene also draws a contrast between flamboyant smoke screens and subtle ones. And he references P.T. Barnum, who later in his career, kind of embraced his reputation as a showman. And would even stage obviously fake events for amusement. But then he contrasts that with influential figures like Talleyrand of the Rothschilds, who cultivated these very bland, unassuming exteriors to facilitate lifelong deceptions.
Exactly. And what's key, I think, in that contrast is understanding your audience and your long-term goals.
Right.
A flashy approach works best, if you're already known for spectacle.
Right.
However, for sustained influence. And the ability to consistently deceive, a bland exterior is often more effective.
Right.
Because it doesn't arouse suspicion over time.
Yeah. It doesn't become tiring or predictable.
Exactly. Your act never becomes, tiring or predictable.
Right. And then he also touches on using silence as a form of concealment.
Yeah.
He brings up, Warhol and Marcel Duchamp and how their deliberate ambiguity and lack of explicit explanation actually kind of amplified the interest and value surrounding their work.
Right. By not fully explaining their art, they invited interpretation and speculation, effectively, controlling the narrative through absence.
Right. It's almost like a reverse psychology.
Yeah.
Right. Where
it is.
The less you say, the more people fill in the blanks.
They fill in the blanks with their own interpretations.
Right.
Which can often work to your advantage.
Yeah. And then there's this other, tactic of subtly undermining rivals.
Yeah.
Through gentle barbs and mockery. But he emphasizes that this is after you've first established a degree of respect.
Right. He uses Barnum as an example again.
Yeah.
And it's a more nuanced approach than outright slander.
Exactly. It's about, once you have that credibility.
Yeah. You can afford to be a bit more provocative.
Yeah.
Without appearing overly aggressive.
Right. And that actually leads us into part 2.
Okay.
Which is create an air of mystery.
Yeah.
So it feels like a logical progression.
Yeah.
Right.
It is.
From concealing your intentions.
It's about cultivating an aura of intrigue.
Right.
And enigma.
Yes. So Greene's argument here is that, in a world where information is increasingly accessible,